Welcome, welcome to Brightline Mind Lecture 6. This is going to be the first part of our two-part series on happiness. And by happiness, I mean pleasure, positive experience, engagement, meaning, positive emotions, all of that. We are going to dissect the landscape of happiness. And I'm excited to spend this time with you. So let's go ahead and get started here. Here's an outline of today's lecture. We will cover more topics related to happiness next week. For this week, we will be addressing what might seem like an obvious point, but it's not a trivial point. Does happiness matter? And we're going to be presenting some research, of course, that shows that it does, as you would expect. We're going to address the very non-trivial question, what is happiness? We will do our best to come up with some definitions or explanations that at least clarify that landscape a little bit. And we're going to spend the bulk of the lecture talking about various aspects related to the most recent model of happiness, the PERMA model. I don't know if it's a model of happiness exactly. It's a model of flourishing, human flourishing. And we're going to cover three aspects in particular of the PERMA model. The P stands for positive emotions. We're going to cover that. The E in PERMA stands for engagement. We're going to cover that. We're going to skip over the R. That stands for relationships. That's going to come in a future lecture. The M stands for meaning. We're going to cover that. The A stands for achievement. We're going to skip over that one because that's not really a component of happiness. So we're going to cover the three aspects of PERMA that can be thought of as synonyms for happiness. And then I'm going to give you assignment number 6. So that's what we're covering today. Next time with happiness, we're going to talk about money and happiness. We're going to talk about culture and happiness. And we're going to talk about some of the biological effects of happiness, how happiness affects us on a cellular level. So that's going to be next week's lecture. So to start out, does happiness matter? Like, who cares if we're happy? I mean, of course we care if we're happy because we feel good, right? And it feels good to feel good. That's a tautology, I think. I think that's the right use of that word. It's an obvious thing, right? It feels good to feel good. But, so what? Does it do anything else for us other than allow us to feel good? Well, remember the thought experiment that I proposed early in this course. If I offered you $10 million in cash today in a duffel bag, for real, but also the promise that it would come with guaranteed misery for the rest of your life, every moment of every day for the rest of your life, would you take it? It's a pretty hardcore thought, and if you think deeply about it, my guess is that you come up with the answer no. I wouldn't want that. Guaranteed misery every moment for the rest of my life. There's almost nothing. I can't think of anything that I would willingly accept for that kind of a trade-off, right? Not even $10 million. Frankly, not even close, right? And when you think about it in that way, it starts to become clear that happiness is the ultimate currency. There's nothing I would accept, right? The happiest marriage in the world, but you'll be miserable every minute of every day for the rest of your life. The most well-adjusted kids, but you'll be miserable every day for the rest of your life. And there's nothing that's worth being miserable every minute of every day for the rest of your life, right? In that sense, happiness is the ultimate currency. Well, happiness is good for more than just that. So a really cool study came out several years ago that is affectionately known as the Nun study. And they used an existing data set. This happens often where a data set is around and someone mines it for some other question than the one that it was intended for. This data set began in 1930 when a group of 178 new nuns who were being initiated into the order were asked to write a short biographical essay as part of a larger study. These nuns were part of a longitudinal study investigating Alzheimer's disease. And all kinds of data was collected about them, and detailed records were kept on them over the years. Nuns, what's neat about nuns is that they live in fairly consistent environments, right? They eat consistent foods. They have consistent habits. No pun intended. I really didn't intend that pun at all, but that was kind of funny. But their lives are similar in so many ways, right? So there's a lot of control in the way they live. So anyway, they were part of a study investigating a longitudinal study investigating Alzheimer's disease. So all this data was collected over them. And later, researchers took those short autobiographical essays, which were a tiny, 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 tiny fraction of the data that were collected on these nuns. And those autobiographical essays were studied and coded for how happy the nuns seemed to be. Now, the question from the nun study, which came out in 2001, had nothing to do with happiness, actually. The research question was, what predicts longevity? What's correlated with longevity? Now, again, these nuns are living in similar ways. They're eating similar foods. They're rising and going to sleep at similar times to each other. They're engaged in similar activities to each other day in and day out. So with that kind of control, you can ask the question, what predicts longevity? Like, for example, does living in a rural versus an urban environment predict longevity? Or, in certain states, sunnier climates versus winterier climates? The answer is no. There's no difference in longevity among those groups in terms of, just where they live. What about pollution, right? The city versus the countryside, huge differences in pollution. That didn't affect longevity consistently. What about IQ? We could take IQs were measured in these nuns. Were nuns with higher IQs likely to live longer than nuns with lower IQs? No. No effect of IQ. What about degree of devotion or religiosity, which, if you think about that, would make a lot of sense, because those who were the least devoted or religious would be experiencing, probably, one might imagine, some kind of chronic conflict between their lives and their inner worlds, right? There they were, nuns, and kind of not feeling that devoted to it. And would that take some years off their life? No, it didn't. These researchers studied every variable in the data set, and only one variable among all of them predicted longevity, and that was happiness. And they got those happiness ratings from those short autobiographical essays. So they had researchers read the essays and then code them for super happy, kind of sort of happy, kind of sort of not necessarily happy, and like really pretty much not happy. So when I heard that, I was curious. I was like, what does a happy one-page autobiographical essay for an 18-year-old brand new nun sound like? What does a not so happy one-page autobiographical essay for an 18-year-old brand new nun sound like? So those essays were put into 4 piles. The top quartile, top 25%. The second quartile, right, above 50%, but somewhere between 50 and 75% happiness. The lower, 3/4 quartile, so from negative 25 up to 0 or whatever, and then the least happy quartile, so the 25% least happiest. I don't know if I explained that perfectly, but I think you get the idea, right? Quartiles. So here's a top quartile essay. Here's what it sounds like. Here's a snippet of it. From Celia O'Payne. God started my life off well by bestowing upon me grace of inestimable value. The past year which I have spent as a candidate studying at Notre Dame has been a very happy one. Now I look forward with eager joy to receiving the holy habit of Our Lady and to a life of union with love divine. You start to see like, oh, yeah, she's pretty happy. And here's a lowest quartile. Now, this is an 18-year-old nun, right? It's not like they're going to say, I hate this, I hate my life, right? So here's what the lowest quartile sounds like. I was born on September 26, 1909, the eldest of 7 children, 5 girls and 2 boys. My candidate year was spent in the mother house, teaching chemistry and second-year Latin at Notre Dame Institute. With God's grace, I intend to do my best for our order, for the spread of religion, and for my personal sanctification. Marguerite Donnelly. So you can feel the difference there, right? Pretty palpable. So, longevity results. Lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of years later, at age 85, 90% of the happiest quartile of nuns were still alive. 90% of them. And 34% of the least happy quartile were still alive. Wowza. A few years later, at age 94, 54% of the happiest quartile were still alive, and 11% of the least happy quartile were still alive. The happiest nuns, on average, live 10 years longer than the least happy nuns. That, my friends, is pretty much exactly the effect of a lifetime of chronic smoking versus not. In case you're curious. 10-year difference between chronic daily smokers and non-smokers in longevity. Another longitudinal study found different benefits to being constitutionally happy. This study was the Mills College yearbook study. Mills College is a beautiful little women's liberal arts college in the Oakland Hills. So just east of San Francisco, over the Golden Gate Bridge, up into the hills and a little south, you find Mills College. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful campus. Still women's only to this day, when most such colleges have long since gone co-ed. And yeah, I've been there. It's a lovely place. I had friends who went there. Of course, the Bay Area is my stomping ground. And researchers studied 114 yearbook pictures from the 1958 and 1960 Mills College graduates. Okay. Now, pretty much everybody was smiling in their college yearbook photo. However, it turns out not all smiles are equal. So there are plenty of researchers, I don't know if you know this, it's kind of interesting. There's plenty of researchers who study facial expressions, and I mean down to the detail where they know all of the 50 muscles that affect the crinkles around the eyes and the mouth. And can tell you what all the different types of smiles are. There's all kinds of smiles. There's menacing smiles, there's smug smiles, there's genuine open smiles that are bids for connection. Anyway, there's all kinds of smiles. So the fact that they were all smiling says almost nothing. There's a certain kind of smile that's called a Duchenne smile. And a Duchenne smile means that the joy in the smile reaches up to the crinkles and the sparkle in the eyes. I know that's kind of a loosey-goosey definition, but it's like, does the smile reach all the way up? Is it genuine? Is it beaming? And they had several independent raters rate these smiles for like, how happy is this person really? Is this a Duchenne smile? Are they really happy? Or is this a pasted on smile, right? And so I just grabbed several pictures online and I rated them myself in terms of sort of not so Duchenne, maybe a little more, up to a full Duchenne smile. You see that? You see that difference there on the right? That's a Duchenne smile. On the left, not so much. So independent raters, several of them, rated the smiles, like whatever it was on a scale from 1 to 10 or whatever, for how Duchenne the smile was. And that was their operational variable. That was their way of measuring happiness. Okay? That's all they had, was how happy was this girl from her smile in her yearbook photo. And then these women were also part of a longitudinal study on something else, and much was known about their lives in other ways, and they were followed over time. So later on, researchers asked, what did the happiness or Duchenne-ness of their yearbook photo predict? And they were particularly, these researchers were interested in marriage. So they asked, were they likely to be married at middle age? And the happier, the Duchenne smile girls were more likely to be married at middle age. Their happiness, as rated by their smiles, was predictive of their marital status at middle age and their happiness in their marriage at middle age. Now, keep in mind, this is not a function of their attractiveness. This is a function of their happiness, as evidenced by their yearbook smile. So now we've got happiness predicting longevity by quite a lot, and predicting happiness and continued marital status and marital happiness at middle age, some, 30 years later. So, happiness. I want you to grab your time in journal or some blank paper if your time in journal is not handy. Some of the factors that are very linked with life satisfaction and happiness, very predictive, are gratitude, optimism, and high independent self-esteem, which we're going to cover at length later in the course. But for now, just know that independent self-esteem is the kind that comes from within, not from comparing ourselves to others. The kind that, like, we know that we're worth something. You know what I mean? Not because we're better at X than Y person is, right? Independent self-esteem, deep inside, internal self-esteem. So knowing these three things, what actions do you think you could take to increase your happiness? Just ponder on that for a second. Write about it a little bit. Ready, set, go. All right. I had kind of a neat thought in my writing on this one. I had the thought of sort of an amalgam exercise, a blend between a gratitude list and an optimism exercise, is to write a future gratitude list, like project myself into the future so that it's a month from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, on my deathbed, like any point into the future, and write an imaginary gratitude list, imagining, how great my life has been and what I'm grateful for then, and sort of blend optimism and gratitude together by play acting an imaginary gratitude list that I might write at some point in the future, just reflecting on how well things have gone and all that I'm so grateful for. And it's kind of an interesting thought of an exercise. I might assign that. It's a good one. All right. So now for the nitty-gritty. What is happiness? In answering that question, I want you to look at this landscape and tell me where the beauty is. Where's the beauty in this picture? I hope that as I ask that question, what comes up for you is there's a lot of beauty in that picture. Those mountains are pretty beautiful. That sky is pretty beautiful. That green is pretty beautiful. The rolling hills are pretty beautiful. The forests are pretty beautiful. That house looking over there on the corner, in the midway up there on the right-hand side, that's pretty beautiful. That's looking like a pretty nice view right there. You see the point? Like, when I ask where's the beauty, the answer is there's a lot of different kinds of beauty in this picture. Kind of depends on what you like, kind of depends on what you want to focus on. And honestly, there's lots of different kinds of beauty. And that's what happens when researchers ask, what is happiness? The reality is that happiness is a pretty varied landscape. There's a lot going on when we shine the flashlight on the question, what is happiness? That said, I'm not going to duck the question. We're going to dive into that landscape, because similar to when I say, where's the beauty here, we can say something about that, right? We can start to talk about the mountains and their beauty. We can start to talk about the valley and its beauty. We can start to talk about the green rolling hills and their beauty, and the sky and its beauty, etc., right? So there is stuff to say, but I just want to start off by pointing out it's a varied landscape. It's not a homogeneous experience, happiness. And we're not the first ones to think about this in positive psychology, right? Philosophers were the first ones to really think deeply about this. And in ancient Greek, the term eudaimonia was one of the terms that was coined that today is sometimes translated as happiness. Of course, it is not exactly happiness in translation. It comes from the origins of eu, which is good, and daimon, which is spirit, good spirit, being of good spirit, being happy, right? Aristotle talked about eudaimonia in a lot of his writings around 350 years before Christ, something like that. And definitions of eudaimonia include notions of human flourishing, living well by doing well. The idea is basically that happiness results from identifying one's virtues or values or strengths, cultivating them, and then living accordingly, and feeling an upwelling of flourishing or well-being by having a life of purpose and meaning. So happiness in the eudaimonic viewpoint is akin to growth or purpose or meaning or virtue fulfilled or something like that. one of my favorite sayings ever is happiness is the byproduct of right living. And I don't mean that in the judgy way, like, living some sort of abstract notion of right living, but I mean like for you, for me, when I started living a little bit more of a structured life, I got way happier. When I got the sugar and flour out of my diet, and when I started going to bed in the evening and waking up in the morning, which is something I always had a really hard time doing as a teenager. I always woke up sometime in the afternoon and then went to bed in the wee hours or the morning, which perpetuated a cycle of depression for me. Anyway, when I started just saner living, I got a lot happier. So, find what right living is for you, but happiness often is the byproduct of right living. You can act your way into happiness a lot faster, I think, than you can sort of just wait for positive emotions to land on you. There's another historical viewpoint here to happiness, which is hedonism, which is the doctrine of maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain from moment to moment. And there was a Greek philosopher around the same time, alive when Aristotle was alive, who was a proponent of this notion. The doctrine of ethical hedonism was espoused by the Greek philosopher Epicurus. And the doctrine here is that our fundamental moral obligation is to maximize our experience of pleasure and minimize our experience of pain from moment to moment. And in the hedonistic viewpoint, happiness is akin to pleasure or comfort or satisfaction or positive emotions. Research shows that people who pursue meaning and purpose, eudaimonia, are happier than those who pursue pleasure. But wise researchers in the positive psychology field caution us against drawing too big of a distinction between these, because hedonism is not irrelevant to life satisfaction. And in reality, eudaimonia and hedonism, if you measure them, often go together. They don't need to be in conflict. So, for example, when you are kind to someone else, positive feelings almost always bubble up out of that. So in any given moment, the shortest route to feeling good actually probably is pursuing some kind of eudaimonic activity, right? So it's sort of short-sighted thinking to separate these too much. They're often linked profoundly. And in fact, in individuals, when you measure them, they're highly correlated. An R-squared of 0.8 is about as highly correlated as any two psychological variables are ever correlated. I mean, this is like the correlation of the IQs of identical twins raised in the same house. I mean, like, that's a really strong correlation. A correlation of 1 is a perfect correlation. That's like the correlation of someone's height in centimeters to their height in inches. It's a perfect correlation. If you know their height in centimeters, you know exactly what their height in inches is. It's the same as you're just converting measurements, right? So it's inches to centimeters. It's a perfect correlation. A correlation of 0.8 is almost that. I mean, it's so high. So they're not the same thing, eudaimonia and hedonism, but they're so tightly linked that people make a big deal about separating them. Now, in the next lecture, I'm going to give some good reason for thinking of them somewhat separately, actually. So I'm going to backtrack on this point later. But for now, I just want to emphasize that they're highly correlated, so you don't need to think of them too separately. Pursuing one is likely to result in the other also. Epicurus himself said this. He said, the life of pleasure coincides with the life of virtue. Now, an interesting study showed what I think the true relationship is between pleasure or hedonistic happiness and meaning or eudaimonic happiness. And that is the following. If you measure high in meaning and engagement, and we're going to define both of those in detail later. If you measure high in having high meaning in your life and high engagement in your life, then adding pleasure has a big impact. Like, you have a life of meaning and a life of engagement, go get yourself a massage. It will do wonders. Go spend some time soaking in a bubble bath. It will do wonders. Go find some really, really ripe, fresh, delicious, organic, locally grown fruit for your breakfast tomorrow at the local farmer's market stand. It will do wonders. However, if you measure low in meaning and engagement, if your life is relatively vacuous and purposeless, pleasure adds little. Do you see that? You can't fill up the cup with momentary good feelings if it's empty of meaning and engagement. Hence, the reason that taking ecstasy doesn't work to make someone who's, living a purposeless existence enduringly happy, right? It doesn't work. Now, we're going to get to the topic of measuring happiness in the next lecture, the part 2 of happiness. We're going to start off that lecture with talking about how to measure happiness. But just for now, I just want to say there's an age-old philosophical debate. This philosophical debate started centuries and centuries and centuries ago, and it continues to this day. And there are esteemed positive psychologists in the field who espouse one or the other of these viewpoints, some mildly, some vehemently, and it's a debate that still exists. So the debate is this: which is the true happiness? Which should we count? Which should we be striving for? Which is the more real? The happiness that we're living right now, that exists right here, right now, as we live our lives in real time. The happiness now, and now, and now, is this happiness how we feel right now? Or is the real happiness the glow of happiness we experience as we reflect back over our lives? As we stand back and think, how happy am I? How happy have I been? How satisfied am I in my life? Is that the happiness that's real? Now, similarly to the eudaimonic and the hedonistic forms of happiness, these two are tightly correlated. If someone's happy now, and now, and now, and then you ask, how happy are you in general? You get pretty similar answers, right? Rarely is someone miserable, 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 but when you ask them overall, they say, yeah, I'm awesome, I'm super happy. It doesn't happen, right? They're tightly correlated, but they're not the same, and there are some real differences. I'm sure I'll mention later in the course. But one of my favorite examples of this is women and sex. Married women with kids and sex. So if you ask them in a theoretical way how much pleasure and happiness they get from sex, they rate it very low. Married women with kids. Sex is a nuisance, they think. They never feel like having sex. Their husbands hound them for sex, and they rate the pleasure that they get from their sex lives somewhere between the pleasure that they get from folding laundry and sitting in traffic. Way down on the list. But if you ask them when they're having sex or when they've just had sex, you can do this with a beeper technique. Are you having sex? Are you having a good time? Right? So you can ask them with a beeper technique. The beeper goes off, they're having sex, they're super happy. They just had sex, they're so glad they did. So sometimes, with some instances, we get huge differences between these two, but those are rare. Those are rare. Mostly when you, and another one is raising kids, right? Kids are the biggest source of joy in my life. But with kids, it's actually the inverse with women, married women with kids. It's the inverse of that. It's the opposite. So they'll tell you from a global perspective that the kids are the most important sources of happiness in their life. But if you beeper sample them moment to moment during their day while they're with their kids, they're miserable. They're stressed, they're harried, the kids are not behaving, there's too much to do. They packed too few diapers in the diaper bag, and they're at the zoo, and they don't have enough wipes, and it's a bad day, right? So there's some funny examples of how, in a couple of specific instances, happiness right here, right now is very different from reflective, global, after the fact happiness. In general, though, they're pretty tightly correlated. And like I said, we still get debate about this, about which sort of, and people have their reasons why they think one is the real happiness over the other. I don't know if you have a preference here. I don't know that I do. I think I'm kind of a fan of both. And I don't know if you've noticed, we still haven't answered the question. Right. So what is happiness? Well, the most current model, which I have to say is more recent than your textbook, comes from Marty Seligman's PERMA model, which was outlined in his 2011 book, Flourish, a visionary new understanding of happiness and well-being. And I believe the PERMA model is fairly widely accepted. It's pretty comprehensive, and it incorporates a lot of factors. I think the A in PERMA is maybe the most controversial. The rest are pretty well established. So PERMA stands for, the P is for positive emotions, which means feeling good. This is the right here, right now, joy, hedonism. This is the hedonism, the pleasure. Ways to increase this are savoring. We're going to talk all about this. Okay, so the P is for positive emotions. Then we go around, and the E is for engagement, which we're going to talk about, finding flow, which means absorption in our activities and doing things that suck us in completely so that we're fully engaged in the execution of these activities. The R stands for relationships, having authentic connections. Again, we cannot emphasize this enough. Relationships provide happiness, happiness, happiness. Authentic, true connections. Not quantity necessarily, but depth of authentic connections. It's the most important thing. The M is for meaning, cultivating a purposeful existence. And then the A is for achievement, which means having a sense of accomplishment, efficacy, a feeling of, I got this, I'm up to the challenge of life. And, doing things that make us feel like, yeah, look at what I've done. Look at what I'm doing. A sense of achievement. Okay. 3 of those 5 can be thought of as synonyms for happiness. The positive emotion bit, the feeling good, right? That's akin to the hedonism that we were talking about. The engagement bit, which we're going to talk about, that has to do with flow. And then the meaning bit, this is the eudaimonia, right? The purposeful existence. So we are going to cover all 3 of these now. There's a lot more research on the positive emotion side, so we're going to cover that in lots of depth. And then we're going to talk about engagement and meaning. So, positive emotions, feeling good. There are many things we could talk about when it comes to positive emotions. Lots and lots of things. So I'm going to list them out here. I'm going to basically now give you an outline of this subsection of the lecture because there's a lot to it. And I don't want to go on and on and on and have you get lost. So here's what we're going to be talking about when it comes to this first aspect of happiness, this positive emotion bit. We're going to talk about the effects or the consequences of positive emotions, kind of like we did at the beginning, like happiness, so what? And we're going to say, well, positive emotions, so what? We're going to talk about positive experiences remembered, what happens when we look back in our lives. You may have heard me cover this material before. It's always good to hear it again. It's interesting stuff. We're going to talk about positive experiences anticipated in the future. There's some interesting findings there. We're going to talk about positive affectivity, which is the trait of the disposition to experience positive emotions. Like some people have more positive affectivity than others. So we're going to talk about that trait and what research shows about it, how heritable it is in particular. And then we're going to talk about savoring, which is the way to increase positive emotions. One of the ways. So first, the effects or consequences of positive emotions. We actually covered this already. So I'm just going to remind you of that and mention another resource that you can tap into if you want to learn more. It's really good stuff. So we covered this in lecture 3, Barbara Fredrickson's broaden and build theory. So what we covered is that positive emotions do this thing to us. They're not static. They interact in our cognitive architecture in a very specific way. Positive emotions, like, for example, making someone laugh, and all of a sudden, all this stuff happens to their cognitive architecture, right? It broadens their outlook, literally, so that they can see and perceive more than they could before. It broadens our attentional focus. It broadens our working memory capacity. That's our IQ right there. It literally makes us smarter to feel good. Kind of crazy. It broadens our verbal fluency. That's a good thing if you're, if you got to talk. It broadens our receptivity to information, makes us more open-minded and receptive. And all of that puts us in a state where we can then build new capacities, build new skills, build new strengths, build new talents, like add on to ourselves. So instead of being closed, we're open, and then suddenly we're in change mode, we're in resilience mode, we're in growth mode. So basically, when we experience positive emotions, we are relaxed, we're safe, and a new world of possibilities opens up for us. When our mood is elevated, we work better, we think better, we respond better, we're more creative, we're more successful, we're more healthy, we're more energized. And positive emotions literally undo the physiological effects of fear and anxiety. I'm talking about the sympathetic nervous system response, the fight or flight response, where our pupils are dilated and our hair is standing on end and our heart is racing and cortisol and ACTH and adrenaline are all coursing through our veins and we're panicked and our attentional focus is narrowed and we can hardly think of anything. We're not seeing anything. We're not hearing anything. We're just thinking, okay, am I going to run? Am I frozen? What am I doing now? Introduce some positive emotions into that mix, which is tricky, but, in the lab, they do this by, showing someone a really hilarious snippet of a video while they're in. You can induce an anxiety state in someone in the lab, and then you can show them a really funny video. And boom, after the funny video, people's physiology comes back to normal crazy fast. Just boom, they're back to normal. So the parasympathetic, the rest and conserve and relax nervous system kicks in and restores equilibrium super quickly if you just introduce a little positive emotion. So picture someone's in a state of anxiety and you reach out to them and you offer some comfort. You talk to them a little bit, you give them a hug, you make them laugh a little bit, and suddenly their body comes back to a state of equilibrium. Barbara Fredrickson says, we should work to cultivate positive emotions in ourselves and in those around us, not just as end states in themselves, but also as a means to achieving psychological growth and improved psychological and physical health over time. I call this the broaden and build theory of positive emotions because positive emotions appear to broaden people's momentary thought action repertoires and build their enduring personal resources. Through experiences of positive emotions, people transform themselves, becoming more creative, knowledgeable, resilient, socially integrated, and healthy individuals. So Barbara Fredrickson, PhD, is the principal investigator, the main professor there, of the Positive Emotions and Psychophysiology Laboratory, the PEP Lab, at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She's got 2 books. Her first one here is Positivity. Top-notch research reveals the 3-to-1 ratio that will change your life. Barbara Fredrickson, PhD. So this work was seminal. She was invited to visit with the Dalai Lama to present this work, and it's all the broaden and build. This is the broaden and build stuff. So if you want to learn more about broaden and build, you want to hear about the specific studies that were done, you want to hear more about what positive emotions can do for you, more about how to cultivate them, this is the book that you want to read. It's on the Brightline Mind website. We've added a new tab called the resources section. So just check for resources on the Brightline Mind website. You'll find this book, and yeah, you can buy it online or anywhere. Fabulous book. So that's the effects or consequences of positive emotions. Let's talk about how our memory and expectations around positive experiences sort of work. So let's talk about positive experiences remembered in the past. Because positive emotions aren't just about how we feel now, they're also about remembered positive experiences from our past, right? We're looking back on our lives. This is the sort of, have I lived a happy life? Well, we look back and we check. So what's that like when we look back and check? How do we remember positive experiences from our past? Well, the most logical assumption is that our memory of past events is the average of the moments that made up the event. So if we were at someone's house for a dinner party, were we happy at time 1? Were we happy at time 2? How happy were we at time 3, time 4, time 5, etc.? And if you average up all of those moments, like let's imagine that I gave you a beeper and beeped you at random intervals through that dinner party and said, hey, how happy are you, right? And we just took an average of all of those measurements. That should give us an estimation of your memory later on, a day later, a month later, a year later, 20 years later, for how happy that evening was, how positive it was. So is that how it works? It turns out it's not. That is not how it works. It's logical, but it's wrong. Which is sort of, if I had to summarize cognitive psychology, I would say it's logical, but it's wrong. That's pretty much what happens when you look under the hood from a neuroscientific perspective. We're not rational like we think we are. Language, memory, perception, none of them work the way you think that they would work. They just don't. Which is why we don't have robots doing our laundry. If cognition worked the way we thought it should work, we would have had robots doing our laundry back in the 1960s when the MIT lab promised us we would. The MIT robotics lab had all kinds of, right, in the Woody Allen movies from way back then, there's all kinds of estimations for how easy it should be to instantiate cognition into machines. And the reality is it's really, really hard because cognition does not work the way you think it does. So one of the things that doesn't work the way you think it would is remembering the past. Turns out that when we think about past experiences, our memories are not an average of all the moments. They're an average of only two things. The most intense moment of the experience, whatever that was, positive or negative, the most intense moment. Why? Because all kinds of chemicals are released in the brain to sort of encapsulate that emotion is highly linked to memory. So you've got an intense moment in there that's going to be captured way above the rest. And then how it ended, whatever came last. The rest is forgotten. Doesn't matter. This reality is immortalized by Daniel Kahneman's peak end theory. He's the first one to measure this and notice this. Genius of all geniuses that he was. So brilliant. And it makes sense if you think about certain events. Like, why are roller coasters so popular? Why on earth would anyone like a roller coaster, right? A roller coaster is basically the experience of waiting in line. And waiting, and waiting, and waiting, and waiting. If you're averaging up all those moments, roller coasters are awful. They're terrible. It's the worst time ever. But then, woo! You get the peak, and you get the end, and you leave going, oh, that was awesome. I want to do that again, right? All this, totally forgotten. It doesn't matter. This is called duration neglect. That we almost completely ignore all of the moderate or in-between times of an event, as well as any consideration of how long the experience lasted. I remember, I'm from California, right? So our amusement parks, they have really long lines. Like, just really long lines. I mean, I remember going to amusement parks and we would spend sometimes 2 hours in line for a ride that, was the hit ride that had just come out and that we wanted to be on. I mean, really, sometimes 2 hours. And I remember days when we'd go on it and then we would schedule to go on it again later in the day. Another 2 hours in line. And one of these rides at Marriott's Great America was called The Edge, and it was a free fall. Roller coaster was basically just being dropped off a 40-story building, but then it caught you at the bottom and whisked you along a little ramp, and but it's called The Edge. And so what that meant was that the ride literally took like 20 seconds, right? And then it's over. And we stood in line for 2 hours to go on that ride twice that day. It's just a classic example of duration neglect. You know what's weird, though, is that we also experience duration neglect when anticipating future pleasures. Like, we get the timeline all wrong. So let's take a look at that research now. What happens when we consider positive experiences as we anticipate them to be in the future? So this research was done on university professors who were coming up for tenure. Now, this is a really awesome way to do a study because, first of all, university professors tend to be a pretty sympathetic population in terms of, how hard it is to get research subjects, and they're more likely to fill out surveys than the average population. But also, tenure is a really trippy and unique kind of thing. It's an event that's coming up. You know when it's coming up, so you can do a forecasting experiment like this and survey someone in advance. How do you think you'll feel when? But also, the stakes are so high. It's like this date in the future where someone might be fired, and it's 7 years out. I don't know if you know fully how academia works, but academia has the longest probationary period of any job in the history of the universe. It's a 7-year probationary period where your job is literally hanging in the balance for 7 years. And if at the end of those 7 years, your colleagues don't grant you tenure, even based on some really inane politics or whatever, you are out of a job, you're fired, and you have to move your family. And in academia, the odds of you getting a job in that same city are almost zero. The odds of you getting another job at all are pretty low because you've just not gotten tenure at the college or university that you were working at. So your entire future, and mind you, it took 4 years of a baccalaureate degree, 2 or 3 years of a master's degree, 3 to 7 years maybe of a PhD program, maybe a couple years of a postdoc on top of that to get to the point where you would even get that chance for a 7-year probationary period. All of that education is on the line, and the average academic job has maybe 60 to 300 applications coming in from super well qualified people for each position. The odds of getting another job are very, very small, and it's going to be in any city in the country or the world. You have no say over where it's going to be because you have this very narrow field of expertise, and there has to be a college looking for somebody who does what you do, essentially. So you can't just say, oh, I would really like to teach at this college. Well, no, they have to get a tenure line up in exactly your department, but also your narrow area of expertise. So the odds are just very, very slim. So not getting tenure is potentially one of the most devastating career situations that anyone can fathom in any profession, just because of the odds of getting another desirable job. They're just so low, right? And you have to move your family, pretty much guaranteed, to some other place, some other city, and you don't know where. And it also is going to take probably a year or 2 or 3 to find another job at all. So given this landscape, I explain this because I want you to understand how devastating it is for a professor if they don't get tenure. It's and psychologically, it's their best friends and colleagues who denied them tenure, basically. The politics of it get very intense. So within this climate, university professors were asked to rate in advance how they thought they would feel in the future when they heard the news that they were receiving tenure. Like, if you get tenure, how will that feel to receive that news? Will it make you really happy? How happy? And professors said, oh my goodness, I am going to feel so excellent when I learn that I have received tenure. Now, fast forward to the month, the day, the year when they actually hear the news and they're surveyed, and indeed they do feel phenomenal. Like, there's hardly another feeling that's as good that can compare with it. They do feel phenomenal. But now, in advance, earlier, they were also asked, how long do you think that excellent feeling will last? Like, your happiness level is going to be bumped up. You say by a lot. How long is that boost going to last? And they say, well, it's going to last for years. I mean, basically, once I get tenure, my entire security is assured. You pretty much can't get fired after you get tenure. It's now, you go from the most uncertain state in the world to the most certain state in the world. You now have one of the best jobs ever, and you can't ever lose it unless you do something really illegal or, whatever, disgraceful. You basically are assured a job until your retirement, which is amazing. So they predict that the awesomeness is going to last for years. Now, they get tenure, they feel awesome, there's this big boost in their happiness levels, but in fact, that feeling does not last. It lasts for just a few months, no more than 2 to 6 months, and then they're back to their baseline level of happiness. Despite the fact that they continue to be now the recipients of, unlimited lifetime security, essentially. Doesn't matter. They're back to their baseline level of happiness within months. Now, if we go the other way and we ask them in advance, how are you going to feel if you don't receive tenure? And they think about that for not very long, and they say, yeah, that's going to be completely devastating. I'll be out of a job. I'll have to move my family. I won't know where. I don't know if I'll be able to get another job again in my field. I don't know what I'll do. And in fact, for those professors who are denied tenure, it is devastating. It's totally devastating. Massive decrease in well-being. Massive. But you ask them in advance, how long is that decrease going to last? And they predict years, right? And as well they should, because now they're out of a job and it might be years before they're actually facing any kind of recovery from that. And the best they're going to get is another tenure track job, which has another 7-year clock on it. They're going to be basically back to square one with 7 more years of having to prove themselves before they even come up for tenure again. So the setback is just breathtakingly enormous. And if they don't get tenure, that's not actually what happens. There's a massive decrease in their well-being, but again, it lasts just a few months, 2 to 6 months. And then, even though their life is still uncertain, even though they've lost their job and they have to move their family and they don't yet have a new situation, they're still back up to their baseline level of happiness within 2 to 6 months, despite the uncertainty. Isn't that fascinating? So this is duration neglect, right? In other words, we're bad at estimating how long certain things are going to impact us. So if you're in a relationship and you're facing a breakup, you are not a good judge of how long it's going to take you to recover from that breakup as you're contemplating, what if we break up? What if I dump him? What if he dumps me? What if she dumps me? What if I dump her? Whatever the situation is. You are not a good judge of how long that's going to impact you. You are a good judge of how it's going to feel, how intensely bad it's going to feel if you break up. You are not a good judge of for how long. That's the point. We are horrible judges of how long things are going to impact us. And the reason that things impact us for a much shorter period of time than we anticipate is adaptation. Adaptation. When continually exposed to the same pleasure arousing or pain arousing stimulus, over time, we experience progressively less pleasure or pain. We adapt to it. This is the same phenomenon that happens in the eyeball. When you step out from a movie theater into the bright afternoon sunlight and your eyes adapt. When you step from the bright, sunny afternoon sunlight into a dark movie theater and your eyes adapt. When you sit down on a chair and for maybe a moment you feel the pressure of the chair up against the back of your thighs, but then that broad, flat pressure quickly disappears and you adapt. You experience it less or not at all. When you move into a new apartment by a train station, and at first you hear the rumble of the trains all the time, and then you adapt. You literally don't hear it at all anymore. Other examples. Adaptation is happening all around us all the time. When you step into a room, into a house, and it smells kind of funny, but after you've been there for 10 minutes, you don't smell it anymore, you adapt. When you get a raise, and for a second it feels really good, and all of a sudden it feels like you have more money, and you think about what you can do with it, and within a month, that feeling of extra money is gone entirely. The money has gotten absorbed into either a higher standard of living, or it's gone to pay off bills, or it's gone wherever it's gone, the way money goes, and you adapt. When you get a new car, and it's so great at first, and then you adapt. Adaptation is so pervasive, it is the number one thing we need to consider in positive psychology as we do exercises and engage in behaviors that we intend to raise our baseline level of happiness. What we are fighting against is adaptation. You start writing a gratitude list every night. Fabulous. But you will adapt. How are you going to keep that gratitude list fresh? Because putting pen to paper the same way every night will have a big impact at first, and then you will adapt. You will stop paying attention as you write your gratitude list. It will fade into the fuzziness of the background. Hence, you need to keep it fresh. You need to have several different ways of writing a gratitude list in different configurations, and switch it up, not on a regular schedule either, like flippity floppity. The point is to throw off your system. This is another point in exercise. You do the same exercise in the same way, the body will adapt. There's research showing that if someone goes for a 30-minute jog, when they don't jog, they will burn X number of calories. I'm going to make up a number. Let's say they burn 250 calories. If they jog for 30 minutes in that same way, regularly, a year later, that same jog will not burn 250 calories. I'm going to make up a number here, and I'm not sure exactly what the research shows, but it's a tiny fraction. They might start burning 40 calories to do that same jog. Their body adapts so that they become the most efficient runners of that particular 30-minute jog ever. The muscles don't need as much fuel. They've learned how to do it without. The body is a ninja at adaptation, which means you can't exercise in the same way and expect it to continue to produce the same results. Your body will adapt and learn how to do that on almost nothing. So if you're a regular exerciser and you're believing what the treadmill is telling you in terms of what you're burning off, it's not. That's not how it goes. You need to switch it up because your body adapts. Adaptation is pervasive. It happens in every cognitive system. It happens perceptually. It happens physically. We are adaptation machines. You can earn progressively 10 times what you earn today, and you will gradually adapt to it. You will feel no richer earning 10x what you earn right now. The reality is that we live on a hedonic treadmill, so that even if our circumstances continually improve, we adapt and return to our baseline level of happiness. You've got to figure out ways to psych out the adaptation system. Keep it fresh, keep it new, keep it changing. One of the famous studies that illustrates the power of adaptation is Brickman Coates and Janoff Bullman, 1978. Their very, very, very famous study on recent lottery winners, mega jackpot lottery winners, and recent paraplegics, people who had been able-bodied in every way, who recently had suffered a tragic accident and were now suddenly paraplegic. So you can't know in advance who's going to win the lottery. So obviously they don't have a baseline for these people's happiness. However, right after people won the mega jackpot Powerball lottery, researchers found them and surveyed them. Said, how do you feel right now? And sure enough, they experienced a surge of pleasure. But after a few months, we're talking 6 months-ish down the line, they weren't back to their baseline level of happiness, but shockingly close. And 6 months down the line, there were some other frightening results. They took less pleasure in daily life. Things like talking with a friend gave them less pleasure, hearing a joke, reading a magazine, than control subjects who hadn't won the lottery. Life was no longer very impressive to them. Not feeling so good in the moment. Very little pleasure coming from the things that they were doing. Recent paraplegics were less happy in the present than the recent lottery winners 6 months down the line, by a little bit, not by as much as you would think. But they gave higher ratings for both their expected future happiness. They had more hope, more optimism than recent lottery winners, and higher ratings for their current pleasures in daily life. They're getting more pleasure from talking with a friend, from hearing a joke, from reading a magazine, than either people who hadn't won the lottery or control subjects. Or people who had won the lottery, either one. Controls or people who had won the lottery. So by some measures, right, the people who think that your happiness now is the happiness that matters, the paraplegics are the happiest ones of the bunch. They're the ones receiving the most pleasure from daily life. And they have the most hopeful, optimistic view of their future life. So let's talk about the disposition to experience positive emotions. That's called positive affectivity, also known as hedonic capacity, which is the extent to which one experiences positive moods. Moods like joy, interest, alertness. One could say happiness. Humor, right? Thinking, being amused. Any sort of positive mood. Contentment, satisfaction. Positive affectivity is a highly stable trait, meaning that it's stable across time. If someone measures high in positive affectivity today, they're likely to measure high in positive affectivity 10 years from now, 50 years from now. They were likely happy as kids. It's also stable in its variability. And what we mean by that is some people have high positive affectivity, but also variable positive affectivity, which means that it tends to go up and down for them. Other people are high and stable, and some people are high and variable. So you're doing the have a good day assignment, right? And so I can describe this as two people can have the same average happy day ratings. So they might average 7, but the one person never has any rating other than 7, or sometimes an 8 or sometimes a 6. But they average 7. And let's say 90% of their ratings are 7. And once in a while they've got an 8, and once in a while they've got a 6, and that's it. Someone could also rate a 7 on average, but they've got 10s and 2s in the mix. And 9s, and 4s, and whatever. They're variable, right? Do you see it? That is also relatively stable, whether someone is across time. So whether someone is highly variable or not variable at all is a stable trait. So it's interesting. Now, this is sometimes a tricky one to explain and a tricky one to wrap your head around, but positive affectivity is independent of negative affectivity. So positive affectivity is the degree to which one experiences positive moods. Like, how happy are you? How positive are you? That actually turns out to be a separate thing from how much do you experience negative moods. It's a separate question. So you can say, oh, I don't really, this person, let's say this person, doesn't experience positive moods much. They might also not experience negative moods much. They might not experience emotions much at all. They might be flat in affectivity. Or they might experience not much positive emotion, but lots of negative emotion. It's a separate question, right? Low in positive affectivity does not mean high in negative affectivity. It might just mean flat. It's a separate question, right? And someone could be really high in positive affectivity and also really high in negative affectivity. They might experience a lot of positive emotions and a lot of negative emotions. We call that a passionate person. So you can be high in both, high in positive affectivity and then high in negative affectivity or low in negative affectivity. It's a separate question. Just because you're high or low in positive affectivity tells you nothing about how much negative emotion you experience. They're separate. So, for example, I am very high in positive affectivity, and I think I'm relatively low in negative affectivity, but maybe not. Maybe I'm moderate or high. I'd have to look at test results again. It's been a while since I've taken these tests. I know I'm super high in positive affectivity, but I also know that I'm way higher in negative affectivity than my husband, say. He's way more steady than I am. He's very high in positive affectivity too. He's a happy guy, but a lot less volatile than I am, a lot less variability, and a lot less disposition to experience negative emotions than I do. So they're separate, they're separable. Positive affectivity is independent of negative affectivity. Now, here's kind of a kicker. Positive affectivity is highly correlated with extroversion. Extroverts are happier than introverts. Just kind of is. As a matter of fact, so much so that researchers have wondered, are they really a different thing? Or when we measure extroversion, are we really also kind of just measuring positive affectivity? Introversion is correlated with negative affectivity and a personality trait known as neuroticism, which is negative mood, essentially. There's other aspects to neuroticism, and you can Google the big 5 personality traits. Extroversion is one of them, and neuroticism is another. Neuroticism and negative affectivity seem to go hand in hand, and extroversion and positive affectivity seem to go hand in hand. So one of the confounding variables here is relationships. Researchers have not known whether, like, which causes which. It's a chicken and an egg problem. Extroverts are more likely to socialize more. And interactions with other people are known to be big drivers of positive experiences, positive mood, and happiness. So it's unclear whether it's the interactions with other people that's driving the positive affectivity for extroverts, so it's unclear which is causing which, right? Because relationships are in the mix there somewhere. Relationships are so powerful. Human connection, human interaction is so powerful. And when you take introverts and you have them interact with people more than they tend to on their own, they get happier. They experience more positive affectivity. So it's unclear what's causing what there. Positive affectivity is highly correlated with marriage status and marital satisfaction and job satisfaction. It's also highly correlated with religiosity or spirituality. When I say that things are correlated, what that means is that they predict each other. It doesn't tell you what's causing what, but it does tell you if you get more of one, you're likely to have more of the other. That might sound a little weird, that it doesn't mean that one causes the other. There could be some other factor causing them. Just like the extroversion, it could be the interactions with other people that are causing that correlation. We don't know. And extroversion, because it's a trait, isn't exactly something you can get more of, but you can try adding more relationship connection to your life and see what that does. But it could be that happier people with higher positive affectivity are just more likely to stay married because, they're nicer to be around. Just feels better to be with someone who's happy than someone who's, not. Or it could be that being married in and of itself leads to positive affectivity. It's unclear which is causing which. Positive affectivity is moderately heritable. Interestingly, the latest research that I read showed it at a 0.4 heritability, whereas negative affectivity had a 0.55 heritability. We're going to talk about that on the next slide. So heritability is the proportion of variation in a trait that's due to genetic factors. This is not what people assume. People always assume that heritability means the amount of a trait in a specific person that's genetic. Like for you, how genetic is your introversion or extroversion? For you, how genetic is your IQ? For you, how genetic is how tall you are? How much of that in you was caused by your genes? That's what people take it as. That's what people assume. But that's not what heritability is. Heritability is the proportion of variation in an entire population. So if you look at how much people differ in positive affectivity in a whole population, like in a whole country, in the world, how much do people vary in that trait? And of that variation, how much of that's genetic? The reason it's that and not in an individual is because, let me give you an example. Let's take IQ. All right. IQ is a somewhat heritable trait. There's some genetic factors in IQ for sure. Okay. When we talk about the heritability of IQ, we need to talk about the variation of IQ in an entire population and how much of that variation is due to genetic factors on average in the whole population. We can't talk about Joe's IQ and whether his IQ is due to genetic factors, because maybe Joe has Down syndrome and he's not super smart at all. His IQ is well below average, and that's almost entirely genetic. It doesn't matter how many puzzles his parents gave him when he was a kid. He has Down syndrome. So his IQ, his in particular, is driven by his genetics. He's got an extra 23rd chromosome. And it's that genetic reality that's driving him being on the lower end of the IQ spectrum. So Joe's IQ is mostly genetic. And we can't be talking about Sally because, and this is heartbreaking, Sally may have experienced profound child abuse. She was shut in a closet for most of her childhood. And her IQ is super low. And Sally's low IQ is due to her upbringing. It's not due to her genetics. Those are environmental factors driving her low IQ. So in any individual instance, the demonstration of the trait in them might be due to one or the other, either genetics or environment, more so. So when we talk about heritability of a trait, we're talking about a population average. We're talking about, in general, in a population, how much are genetics in play on average, in general. Do you see that that's what we're asking when we talk about heritability? It's a generalized question. It's not a specific question. So the fact that, I forget what the heritability is of IQ, but let's say it's 25% or something, or it's somewhere between 25 and 50%. I think the estimates actually really differ quite a bit. I think there's huge argument. Whatever. Let's say it's 25%. But Joe's IQ is way more than 25% due to his genetics. And Sally's IQ is way less than 25% due to her genetics. Do you see that? So, yeah. So I say this just to say that for you, when we talk about the heritability of positive affectivity, that does not speak to how malleable it might be in you. I personally have gone from relatively low in affectivity to one of the happiest people around. My positive affectivity has turned out in my life to be very, very malleable, very affected by environmental factors. And I think that's because I have a brain that is predisposed potentially to high positive affectivity if exposed to the right circumstances. And if not, I have this other thing in the mix called addiction and another one called depression. And given certain environments, I can spiral into profoundly low positive affectivity and profoundly high negative affectivity really easily. So my personal mix leaves me open to a huge range of possible outcomes, depending on how I live. I wouldn't know that if I hadn't already explored so many of the varieties of the different ways of living, right? I've gone to great lengths to explore different ways of living. And it turns out that for me, they have huge impacts on my mood states. I don't know if that's true for you. You might live within a more narrow range no matter what environments you're exposed to. I don't know. So I say all this to say that the graph I'm about to show you is absolutely an average over populations. It says nothing about the extent to which your mood states are malleable based on how you choose to live. So most personality traits are moderately heritable. Somewhere in the 30 to 40 to 50% heritable. Heritability estimates come in in decimals, so 0.3, 0.4, 0.5. Moderately heritable. And the idea is that our happiness set point can still be changed up or down. So this old wheel here, Lubomirsky, Sheldon, and Chicade, 2005, it's generated a lot of arguments, a lot of debate. They say it's a very sketchy average at best. It does get us thinking about the three components here. Everyone agrees that life circumstances are low in terms of impacting our positive affectivity, that it's not our life circumstances that are the big drivers. It's our genetics and how we live our life. The genetics is the set point, and the sustained volitional activity is how we live our life. Again, I would make a case that for me, sustained volitional activity seems to be, in some ways, 80 or 90%. in the sense that I can really swing it widely. I can turn my life into a living hell almost day after day after day and make it so that I can hardly get out of bed and I feel profoundly awful a whole lot. Or I can swing it so that I'm pretty happy and experience positive moods lots of the time, day in and day out, right? Now, there's some set point in there because I think even living the way I do, feeding my body good food, giving it, movement and love and spirituality and human connection and all those things, there are plenty of people who would not be as happy as I am under those good conditions. So I've got some genetic predisposition to have a relatively sunny personality. If I look at my mother and I look at my father, very grateful, happy people. I probably come from good stock when it comes to happiness in terms of a set point. But I've got this addiction piece in the mix, which means that how I live my life has a big impact. So I want you to think broadly about the impact that your heritability, that your genetics might play in your life. Again, just because these percentages exist here on this slide does not mean those are your percentages. In an individual instance, it can be wildly different from that. Now we're coming to the end of our discussion of positive emotions, but remember this isn't the end of the lecture because we still have to cover engagement and meaning. But let's talk a little bit about savoring. Savoring is our awareness of pleasure in the moment and our deliberate attempt to make it last or to imprint it in our mind for future memory availability. How often we savor and whether we savor life's pleasant moments turns out to be a relatively stable trait. Are you a savorer? Turns out that if you are, you're more likely to be happy in general. And turns out that if you're not, you can learn to be. So this is just like optimism. There's a great book by Marty Seligman, Learned Optimism. Turns out that you can become a learned savorer. It's a great word, savorer. So think with me. What does savoring consist of? And if you want to grab a pen, our timeout is coming, time in. Our time in is coming soon, so grab a pen. Just take some notes here. What do you think savoring consists of? So if you're noting some kind of mindfulness in the mix, some kind of awareness, that's a good start, right? You have to have some kind of awareness or mindfulness or being in the present moment. I would add in there something I like to add to my savoring. I'm definitely sometimes a good savorer. I'd like to add that it's helpful to inject some kind of memory cue into the moment, some way consciously of trying to cast this current pleasure, this current experience into a form that will be recallable in the future when you so choose. So something about it that makes it memorable, some kind of memory hook, maybe even just a pledge to oneself, I will remember this. I remember once I had a massage. It was a wonderful massage. I'm a big fan of getting massages when I can. And at the end of the massage, the masseur said to me, I think it was a masseuse actually, masseuse said to me, feel how your body feels right now. Savor it. Soak it in. And know that you can bring this state of your body back at any time in the future that you choose. Let the softness of your muscles and the relaxation of your frame and the way you're sinking into the table right now take a form that is available to you at any time that you choose to come back here. And let it be so. And by saying those words, they created such a profound memory cue that I was indeed able many times in the future to, and I just right there, right then, and perhaps extended it to you even. I was able to create a memory trace that transformed not just my mind, but my body many times in the future after that. So think about some experiences that you really enjoy. Write them down. What do you love? What's worth savoring? What gives you real pleasure? And what actions can you take to more effectively savor those pleasures? All right. Let's go to the next component of happiness, which is engagement. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who never asked anyone to pronounce or spell his name, but he's happy to go by Mike, and he's given this as a beautiful phonetic pronunciation key for his name, Csikszentmihalyi. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, is a professor at Claremont Graduate College in Claremont Graduate University, rather, I think, in Southern California. And for decades, he's been studying what he calls flow, which is defined as the state of complete engagement or absorption in an activity, in which one is functioning at full capacity, is unaware of the passage of time, and feels invigorated afterwards. In flow activities, there's this sense of losing space and time, losing sense of oneself as an active agent at all, because the activity is so absorbing that there's nothing but just you doing the activity, complete engagement in the activity. In particular, it feels like there's timelessness, like you get sucked in and then spit back out the other end, where you're just so absorbed. Now, there are some assumptions about flow that people tend to have that are not true. It doesn't have to be a solitary activity. So, for example, some people can experience, many people, I think, experience flow with dinner party conversation. That's a group flow activity. Now, if you're sitting at the table self-conscious and, then that's not a flow activity for you. But for those who feel comfortable and relaxed and engaged and absorbed, and you're unaware of the passage of time for long stretches of time, and you feel invigorated afterwards, that's a flow activity for you, even though it requires other people to do it. Another misconception is that it requires amazing expertise, like that only amazing artists could experience flow during painting. Not so. You have to have some, you have to have some level of skill at it. You can't just pick up a paintbrush for the first time, probably, and find flow in painting. But so long as you've got some level of skill and you enjoy it immensely, you do not have to have expertise. What it requires is a good match between your level of skill, whatever it is, and the degree of challenge that the activity provides for you. If those don't line up just right, you can't find flow. And we're going to explore that here in just a second. Now, be careful, because there's some activities that meet many of these criteria, but not all, and they're not flow. So don't confuse flow with junk flow activities. Watching TV comes close to meeting the criteria for flow. So does playing video games. So actually does gossiping with friends. However, they don't require any challenge. There's no degree of challenge involved in those activities, and they leave you feeling depleted rather than invigorated. They leave you feeling sucked dry and vaguely gross and ugh. Like, try watching TV for 4 hours. Try playing video games for 4 hours, or mindlessly surfing Facebook for 4 hours. Yuck. So the key is, do you feel invigorated and enlivened and strong afterwards? If so, then it's flow. Now, here's a graph showing skill level on the bottom axis. The x-axis there is skill level from low to high. And then the degree of challenge that the activity presents to you on the y-axis. If there's no challenge at all, hardly any challenge, if the challenge is very, very low, then even if it matches your skill level, it's still probably not flow. We're down here in the realm of, chores, or again, watching television. When you increase the challenge just enough, and therefore you increase your skill level just enough, now you start to find flow. If it's too challenging, it produces a state of anxiety compared to your skill. If it's not challenging enough, then it's just too relaxing, or you've got too much control over the activity and it's not stimulating you enough. You're a little too low. in this graph for the flow state. So flow is where your skill meets the challenge and you get absorbed into the activity completely. Flow is highly conducive to the development of expertise. So, for example, 12 and 13 and 14-year-olds experiencing flow in some kind of activity is highly predictive of them being pulled back to that activity and further developing skill in that activity and having some kind of real talent or mastery of that activity at the age of 17 or 18. There's something about flow that is incredibly invigorating, intoxicating, attractive, momentum building, motivating. People who experience flow a lot at work report being really satisfied in their jobs. There's something about flow in and of itself that seems to be inherently very good. And as such, engagement is one of the components of a flourishing life. Having ways, finding ways, engaging in activities that lead us to this flow state. So, what activities pull you into a state of flow? And how can you do them more often? Ready, set, go. Okay. Lastly, on these 3 of the 5 components of flourishing, we've got meaning. Living a meaningful life. It's an interesting thought. There is, or certainly could be, a pharmacology of the pleasurable life. But there is not, and never will be, a pharmacology of the meaningful life. Meaning is knowing what your strengths are and using them in service of something bigger than yourself. Roy Baumeister and Kathleen Vohs associate the quest for meaning in life with the following. Number 1 is purpose, which they talk about as how present events draw meaning from their connection to future outcomes. So you're doing stuff today in service of some future outcome. You're working towards something. You're on a mission. But then also there's values in the mix. Values justify certain courses of action. It means something to us because of our values. There's a reason that it all matters. And it comes back to our values. There's also some efficacy in the mix, self-efficacy, believing you can make a difference. And increased feelings of internal goodness and self-worth are the natural result of engaging in this process. You feel better when you're a person on a mission, engaged in certain pursuits, aligned with your values, believing that what you're doing makes a difference. It all just raises your self-worth. So what are the primary sources of meaning in your life? And where could you invest your time and energy to increase the meaning in your life? All right. Assignment number 6. Assignment number 6 has 3 parts. I think, though, that you will find this to be a little bit less of the heavy lifting than last week's assignment. I know that last week's assignment was pretty intense, and I anticipate that you might be arriving at this week not having devoted as much time to last week's assignment as you wished you had, and not necessarily feeling a state of completion around last week's assignment. I could be wrong about that, but that's my guess based on how meaty last week's assignment was. And so the first part of this week's assignment is actually to wrap up the life crafting work that you did over the previous 2 weeks by distilling it all down to 3 habits that you are committed to implementing one at a time until they become automatic. So what this means is write down 3 habits, take the first one and start implementing it right now, and just focus on that. And then I want you to have another one waiting in the wings so that when the first one feels completely automatic, at least a month from now, but maybe even 2 or longer until that first one feels completely automatic, then you can layer in the second one and wash, rinse, repeat, right? Wait until that second one is completely automatic before you layer in the third one. It's fine if you want to have a list of additional habits beyond the 3 that you would like to implement sometime in the future. It's fine if you also have a list of, the antecedent, which means like what's going to come right before you do that habit and whether it's flexible or brittle and all that stuff. But I want you to let go of whether you've done all that perfectly. If you want to come back to spend some time on assignment 5 in the future, it's definitely a place where you could spend more time. But all you need to move forward successfully from last week's lecture, all you need is a list of 3 habits. You could jot it on a napkin right now. Boom, boom, boom. And then you need to have started implementing the first one. No more, just the first one. Okay? So I want you to let go of any expectations right now of doing a more perfect assignment 5. What you've done is fine. If you feel inspired to go back and work on it more in the future, that is totally fine and great. But you will get tremendous value out of assignment 5 from last week if you just, you've done the best that you could do up until this moment on that, and make sure that you have 3 habits written down that you're committed to implementing one at a time. Okay? So that's the beginning of assignment 6, is to make sure you're at this point where you've got 3 habits written down. The second part of assignment 6 is to read the textbook on pleasure and positive experience and happiness. That's chapters 3 and 4. If you want to get Marty Seligman's book, Flourish, that's great too. You'll have more current stuff on the PERMA model in that. But there's a lot of good research here in Chris Peterson's book on pleasure and positive experience and happiness. Those chapters are good too. And then finally, it's time to complete the Have a Good Day assignment. So here's how you can do that. Read over your data, journal on what you find, and if you like, post in our Facebook group about it. Now, on the Brightline Mind website, you're going to find a more thorough write-up instruction, just a little bit more thorough than this. But I want you to keep the following questions in mind. Here's what you're looking at. Number one, what tends to make up a good day for you? What are the components that increase the goodness of your day? What do you systematically find makes your day better? Similarly, what tends to make up a bad day for you? What systematically makes your day worse? What are the patterns, essentially? So look back over all the things that you marked as, things that made your day better and things that made your day worse. Probably do them one at a time, separately, so you can just see the patterns as you flip through the pages. Were there any surprises in there? I'll give you some classic examples. Maybe you thought that doing laundry would make you less happy, but it turns out that on the days that you did laundry, you always underlined that as being something that contributed to your day being happier. Maybe this is a classic one from when I used to teach positive psychology in college. What invariably happened was, for the 20-year-old boys that I was teaching in my class, they expected that Saturday and Sunday, when they had nothing to do but lie around and play video games, that those would be their happiest days. And those were reliably their least happy days. And they concluded that being isolated and unproductive did not make them happier, that sleeping in and playing video games did not make them happier. That in fact, what made them happier was being productive, like getting out of bed, going to class, and then being with their family and friends made them happier too. So they thought that grandma's birthday party, they thought that, dinner at their cousin's house would be a drag, and it turned out to be a great time and a big boost to their happiness. So time with friends and family was a big boost to them. It was typically surprised them, because they didn't think, they're 20-year-old boys. They didn't think that spending time with their family was going to make them happier. So were there any surprises in what you found actually makes you happy that you didn't think would make you happy, or things that actually decreased your happiness, like sleeping in and playing video games, whatever the equivalent of that is for you, that you thought would make you happy but actually didn't? Next question is, like, if you just average up the number of ratings that you gave, what score do you have? What's your average level from 1 to 10? How happy are you on average? But of course, the average doesn't tell the whole story. There's also the issue of variability. Let's say your average is a 7, or let's say your average is the 3. Do you hover around that number very tightly, or is there a lot more variability? Are there ways that you can incorporate more of the activities that really contribute to your happiness into your life? Can you do those things more? And are there ways you can chip away and do less of the things that bring you down? And what have you learned? What are your key takeaways? What are your ahas? Anything? Those are the questions to keep in mind. I've phrased these a little differently in the write-up, so be sure to access the document on the Brightline Mind website. But those are the 3 things that make up assignment 6. And I have enjoyed spending this time with you. Thank you so much for being with me. And I will see you next week. Bye, everyone.